All right. Good morning again. Welcome back to Ottawa Hockey Analytics Conference. Our next session is going to be an interview with Jack Birch, and it's going to be led by Brian Macdonald. Brian Macdonald is currently a special faculty at Carnegie Mellon University. Previous to that, he was director of hockey analytics at ESPN, and before that with the Florida Panthers. Jack is a professional scout with the Winnipeg Jets, and I'll let them go more into detail about their backgrounds. And take it away, gentlemen. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Struckers, and thanks for having us here. Very happy.
Brian, one more thing. I'm sorry to interrupt. Just a reminder to everybody that this is being recorded, and that if you want to post questions for Brian and Jack, but I think mostly for Jack, go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and I will pass them along.
All right. So thanks for having us. Thanks to the organizers for having us here. I'm very happy to be talking with Jack Birch, who I met in Florida. He's a scout for the Jets, but he's based in Florida, and so we met at Panthers games. He goes to a lot of Panthers games, and he also informed us this morning, in case anyone was wondering, that the weather is very nice in Florida right now. So thanks for that reminder, Jack. Jack's just got a really interesting background, and especially as it pertains to data and using data in hockey. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today, as well as just scouting and hockey in general. So thanks, Jack, for agreeing to do this interview. And maybe we can start with just some of your background, and especially, how you got interested in using hockey and data.
Sure. Thanks, Brian, for the invite. Welcome to all your guests, and I'm quite happy to talk a bit about my background. And I trace it right back to when I was an undergraduate at the University of Waterloo. And at that time, there was several faculty members in the kinesiology department that were doing research with the NHL. And one of those individuals, a guy by the name of Dr. Pat Bishop, was actually doing a risk injury study for the National League to see whether or not they could predict why injuries were occurring and what they could do about it. And so Pat had hired myself and another good friend of mine we actually attended Leaf games and recorded body contact on the ice and see whether or not the types of hits that were occurring led to injuries or that type of thing. And that data was fed back into Pat's research, and I don't need to go into that. But at the time, what that did is it perked my interest in terms of the type of research and collection of data that could be done in a National Hockey League environment and a hockey environment. So that led to, at the time, in my own mind, or my own thinking, the Philadelphia Flyers were the reigning champions of the National Hockey League, and they were classified as the bullies of Broad Street, as we'd all know. So my interest at the time was that, well, does this type of play, aggressive behavior, lead to success in hockey? And so I came up with a minor project as my undergraduate thesis to look at penalty minutes in the National Hockey League to see whether or not individuals and teams were more successful as the penalty minutes went up. And that led to a nice little publication, which was a little bit unusual for an undergraduate, but that it also eventually led me to pursue a master's degree at Waterloo. And because of my connections with the National Hockey League previously, a gentleman by the name of Brian O'Neill, who was the vice president of the National Hockey League, gave me access to penalty data of the National Hockey League and the types of penalties that were being called. So I went to Montreal, sat there for 6 weeks going through all of the penalty records that the league was performing at the time and tried to quantify the types of penalties that were occurring and then correlate that to whether teams were having success or individuals were having success in the National Hockey League. And that led to another paper that was published in a master's degree. But at the same time, it got me some connections in the hockey world. And I eventually ended up as an assistant coach with Bill Mahoney, the national, he was at McMaster University at the time. He ended up going on to the National Hockey League with the Capitals and the Minnesota North Stars. And it got me in my first coaching, teaching job at McMaster University. It seems like 100 years ago. But that led to another head coaching job at the University of Waterloo, which got me back into my familiarity grounds, or the people that I knew there. And I started collecting data towards different types of plays that were occurring on the ice with my team. And there were several people in the computer science department that were very keen on helping me do that. And so we were collecting data at that time. That led to an assistant coaching job with the New York Rangers. And at the time when I got there, I was quite surprised by the lack of data that was being collected. This would have been 1985, that was being collected by NHL teams in itself. And so we instituted a program right away with the hockey ops department in New York and the IT department to start collecting the Roger Nielsen scoring chances data and transferring that into some kind of predictive analysis. Well, eventually what happened was, as most people, we got fired from New York. Phil Esposito came in and took over and graciously offered to let me take the next 2 years of a contract and pursue a doctorate degree at the University of Waterloo. In that time, then I was more interested in the scouting side of things. As I told Brian the other day, what happened was the year that we got fired in New York, good friends of mine and Jacques Martin and Mike Keenan and Jean Perrault had all had great success. John had just won a Stanley Cup. Mike had gone to the Stanley Cup finals twice, I think. And Jacques Martin had been the division head coach champion or winner in St. Louis at the time. So I said, you know what, if I'm going to continue in hockey, I better get over to the management side of things and try and get some longevity out of it. And that's what I did. I started to look at how players were selected to the league. And got more interested in the scouting aspect of the game. And that led me to Jim Gregory and Frank Bonello at Centro Scouting. Jim was the vice president of the National League at the time, and I asked for access to scouting data that I could take and see if I couldn't come up with some way to predict which players would make it to the National Hockey League and which players wouldn't. And so they gave me access to Centro Scouting. They had 10 scouts working for them at the time. They would go out and collect data across the world, both in Europe and in Canada and the United States. And they would write handwritten reports on players they'd seen across the countries. So the first thing I was able to do was to quantify these, to recode the qualitative reports that they were handing in, and quantify it, put it in some numerical format, and then run several different statistical analyses to come up with, I used multiple classification analysis to come up with which players that came into the hopper at the same time in the National Hockey League eventually made it to the league versus those that didn't make it. And that was using all of Centro Scouting's data for a 10-year period to do that. And that eventually led to me getting the opportunity to work with people at Centro Scouting and across the league on an individual basis. And the way I got access to the data was, as Jim Gregory had said to me, we'll get you access to the data, but it has to be agreed to by 6 general managers or 6 different general managers in the league. So at the very beginning, when teams were coming into Toronto, I had to meet with guys like Ron Caron and Emile Francis with the New York Rangers, and Bob Pulford and Jack Davidson with the Chicago Blackhawks, and Jack Button. These are all gentlemen that have been either managers or assistant managers in the league. And I had to convince them why it was important to collect this data and in order to help them with their drafts. And needless to say, it was a real challenge. And I think that that's probably what lots of analytics people or statisticians or hockey people are going through today, is trying to convince people the importance of collecting data in order to make some level of prediction. But I managed to do that. I managed to find ways to illustrate to them that by doing this type of work, it would help them promote or eliminate or rank players based on scouting reports, and then correlating those reports into some usable fashion where they could make some predictions. And that turned out to be a pretty successful enterprise for me at the time. I managed to get a doctorate degree out of it. But more importantly, what it did was it introduced me to several different head scouts across the National Hockey League, because once the league hired me, I had felt that it was important for me to get out onto the road and see where this data was coming from. And I got the opportunity to travel with head scouts from various teams across the league. I spent 4 years doing that, where I would travel and we would talk. And as some of you people would know, when you're driving across the prairies to go from Regina to Lethbridge or Medicine Hat or Calgary, there's a lot of time for discussion, and it was terrific. It gave me the insight into what scouting was all about. And eventually what that led to was a gentleman by the name of Pat Quinn, who said, how do I get this type of information full time? And I said, easy, you just pay me a lot of money and I'll come and work for the Vancouver Canucks, which I did. And that within a couple of years, they had promoted me to the director of amateur scouting, and I got to work with some great people, Pat Quinn, Mike Penny, various people across in the Canucks organization. But that eventually led to being fired again when the house got changed, and that took me into a different direction altogether. And I set up my own scouting business and traveled across Europe to collect data on elite leagues in Europe. I noticed Megan talked in her keynote there this morning about how important it is to get information from across various leagues. And one of the areas I felt at the time when I was collecting my data was that the elite leagues in Europe weren't being scouted from a pro point of view near well enough. There was individual teams doing it, but not on the scale that they're certainly doing today. And there were very few European scouts. So I set up a business where I was hired again by several different National Hockey League teams to collect data for them. And I went and spent 4.5 months of the year in Europe, as well as doing the American League and the National League games in North America, and then looked at the top 50 prospects towards the draft. So it got me a wealth of experience again of using data to try and rank players towards the draft by not only just scouting these players, but by having scouting reports fed into my system, and it worked pretty well. And that led to a connection with Mike Keenan that got me down here in Florida as his director of hockey operation or assistant manager, and that's where I'm at today. I'm in Florida now. I have the opportunity to teach an analytics introductory class to the MBA students here at Florida Atlantic University. And I've had a great opportunity to work with Kevin Shoveldayoff and his staff as a scout, professional hockey scout for the Winnipeg Jets. That seemed like a long-winded thing, but that's
no, that was all great. So I was curious, what kinds of data were you collecting for your business, and also like central scouting and when you were the coach at Waterloo?
The interesting thing, first of all, when I was coaching at Waterloo, there was a guy that worked in the computer science department. His name was Ron Hurdle. And for those of you who don't know the University of Waterloo, their computer science faculty is well known throughout the country, I would assume. And he was most interested. He was a hockey fan too, and so he was most interested in taking scoring chances +4 and who was on the ice and what happened when certain like in 6-on-5 situations or 5-on-3 situations, how you could improve your systems of play in order to improve your chances for success. And at the time, it was very crude and raw, but what we ended up doing is I had 5 or 6 undergraduate students at the time collecting data, much like Pat Bishop had done that with me at the time. And we started to zero in on factors that would lead to success. And it worked. And so I took that type of information with me to New York and tried to apply it there. The interesting thing, though, is that as I got more familiar with the scouting programs across the league, it was quite surprising to me that although these scouts were evaluating players on a daily basis, writing up reports, there was very little work being done to take their reports and try and collate that into some level of prediction. And that's where I got interested in it. So when I got to Central, I convinced Frank Bonello and Jim Gregory, who were in charge of Central Scouting at the time, was let's take these scouting reports, let's take these scouts information, see if we could code it, quantify it, and then measure it as we, across various leagues and teams and standardizations and that type of thing. And it meant rewriting some of the reports that they were filing. My dissertation had I had included somewhere in the neighborhood 150 some variables when we first started, and by the time we got down to the bare facts of it, we were getting somewhere between 85 and 90% of the variance being explained by 10 to 12 variables. And so those were the things that I tried to key in on with the Central Scouting people, is say, let's get an evaluation for their skating ability, their hockey sense, their physicalness, their physical presence, their shot, those types of things. And we also came across several variables that we found interesting, going back to the research people at Waterloo, was people that were connected in the sport, whether it was they had a father playing, a brother playing, an uncle had played in the league. And we looked at family connections, and there was that kind of data that was available to us. And then stuff like ethnicity, with the globalization of the game and players coming from Russia and the Czech Republic. And at the time, it was French Canadians versus English Canadians that were dominating the sport, and the advent of globalizing it. And we wanted to see where, where players were coming from and the types of behaviors that they were demonstrating versus the North American game and that type of thing. We always talked about, the Russians and their lateral play as opposed to their north-south play, sort of thing. So those were all things that were taken into consideration, and eventually, I guess, guided me in terms of the decision making that I wanted to make as the director of amateur scouting in Vancouver, and then when I was ranking players for these various teams in my scouting business, and then again when I was the director of hockey operations, assistant manager here in Florida. We started to streamline the types of reports that we felt were important towards predicting the individual success of teams or individual success of players. And by predicting individual success of players, it allowed us to do a little bit more work in terms of team building.
That's really cool. So, so I wanted to go back to something you said before. You had to talk with GMs and convince them to use this. You were talking with a lot of hockey people early on to convince them that this is important. I mean, do you have any specific examples, anecdotes of times when you successfully were able to change someone's mind about the importance of data?
Yeah, one of the most interesting ones is I met with Jack Davidson, who was the assistant manager of Chicago, and Bob Pulford, and a guy by the name of Jim Pappin, who Leaf fans would know for years. And I was trying to explain how family connections, in other words, if you were Mark Howe and the son of Gordie Howe, your chances of getting to the National Hockey League were somewhere between 15 to 18% better than if you didn't have any connection at all. And they looked at me like, when I was talking about the other stuff in terms of relative birth age and, various variables, they had a difficult time understanding. I shouldn't say difficult time. They were a little bit skeptical. But as soon as I talked about birth lines and family connections, Jim Pappin stepped up, and he was a big horseman in terms of betting at the track. And he said, bloodlines, yeah, that's talking about, horses are coming from their bloodlines. And as soon as that connected, they connected into everything else. And so that, very early in these meetings with guys like Ronnie Caron, I had to find ways to take the statistical stuff, the statistical analysis, and try and translate that into everyday events that were occurring in the game. And Ronnie Caron was terrific in terms of, he came into the interview with me in the head office in Toronto, and he spent 2 hours telling me what scouting was all about, which was great from my perspective. And at the end of the interview, he said, okay, this is good. We'll do this sort of thing. And so but I've had that throughout, every time I met a different head scout, I had to go through like a Jerry Melnick that worked for Philadelphia. I'd have to go through the whole spiel to convince him that I wasn't out there to try and steal their jobs. I was out there to supplement their jobs. And I'm sure that that's what a lot of the analytics people, students are up against today, is the scouting departments, look and say, well, why do we have these analytics people? Why aren't you satisfied with our work? And my comment would be, and I think Winnipeg is a perfect example of it, is we have an extensive scouting staff. Mark Chipman and Kevin Shawadev have felt that they need to do that type of research. Research and development, and scouting is the best way to, is the way to do that if we were going to survive in Winnipeg. And I think we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 5-6 full-time analytics people working within our department right now. And we've been able to combine the hockey people and the analytics people very easily. And I think that's probably where I would put myself in, as I'm sort of in the middle of that group. I've got a pretty good hockey background in terms of coaching at the National League level, certainly scouting at the National League level, some management at the National League level, and I've been doing it. I've been in the National Hockey League now, working full time for close to 37 years. So it's easier for me to be able to talk to scouts on the road and different general managers about analytics than some of the people that are just coming into it, perhaps.
All right, I think we have to get to some audience questions in a minute, but I'm going to ask one more quick question. Can you give an example of how do you interact with your own analytics team? What's like a common thing? Do you interact with them much, and what is something commonly that you talk about?
One of the things that, at least I can talk about it from the pro scouting point of view, because that's who I work most closely with, and that's what I'm part of. And I have my own territories as a professional scout, and I feed reports on a daily basis, that type of thing. But what Kevin and Larry Simmons, our assistant manager, and Craig Heisinger did very early on in the process, is when they started to go into the analytics, is they introduced the analytics people right into our scouting meetings, and they would come in and sit down with us, and we would go through our scouting meetings. And if we were, if there was any question to be asked, we would be able to sit there right and talk immediately and ask, can you pull up this type of information? And there'd be discussion over, how many times was such and such, on the ice when we were down a man, or I shouldn't say down, when the goalie was pulled, and what defensive pairings were there, and different things like that. But the best part is that I've been able to pick up the phone and call or send an email to these guys all the way along with a question that I would have on scouting, and can you track this type of information right now? And with the advent now of them being able to collect data, the tracking data that's going to come into this league, I remember going back, I was dealing my undergraduate career, and I had come up with this idea. There was a whole history of research in sport that dealt with the centrality of sport, and in terms of where preferred positions were in any given sport and who filled those positions. And one of the things I wanted to do at the time with hockey was put a camera above the rink and track the puck. And what we could do is we could see where all the players were relative to the puck at any given time, and those that were spatially located in the center of it would be the likeliest of being the leaders and that type of thing. And now we're doing it. I mean, it's an amazing thing to me that the type of data that's about to become really prevalent for researchers of my ilk or people that are far more advanced than I am, for sure. That's the kind of thing that is exciting. And when you talk to the hockey people around it, they're just beginning to see, when we can start talking about the speed of players or how fast the play is moving and how fast the puck is moving and that type of thing. It's really exciting about what we're about to head into in terms of hockey data collection.
All right, great. Thank you, Jack. I think we're going to turn it over to Shuckers now to moderate some Q&A.
Yeah, I've got some questions that have come in, Jack. Thank you for all that.
Sure.
That was really awesome. Pleasure to hear about some of that stuff. First question comes from an aspiring young scout who wants to know, is there some simple set of data that they can take manually if they're going to scout somebody for 2-3 games that'll help them better understand a prospect?
Yeah, for sure. As I said before, I had started with several variables, and we got it down to maybe 10 usable things that could be measured on the ice. And one of the things is that, obviously skating has become such a big part of the National Hockey League and the speed of the game. And hockey sense, I would say, is, you've got to look to see whether a player is reading the play, whether he reacts to the play. I've always talked about time under control, where he's able to take a pass or break up a play, and how long it takes him to control it and make the next play, and those types of things that gives you some measure of their hockey sense. And obviously size, physicality. Size isn't when I talk about size, I'm not talking about height. I'm talking about the physical presence on the ice. And the Theron Fleury's of the world had proved to us years ago that height doesn't necessarily mean that you're a physical player or have that presence. There's smaller players that have had that presence for years. And so to say to a young scout right now, my comment would be is to get out there and get a good evaluation of a person's skating ability, their hockey sense. Do they see the plays quickly? And are they a presence on the ice every time they're there? There's guys that go out and float, we'll call it, and there's guys that are constantly in motion and have a presence on the ice every time they step on. Those are the three key things. But we do measure competitiveness and drive and try and put numbers on them as we move along too. So.
Did we lose Shuckers?
Yep, we did. I'm on Claire's computer.
Okay.
Real quick. So Jack, the next question I want to pass along is, given all that you've seen over the years, what are some of the biggest changes that you've seen? And then how do you see that playing out in terms of the analytics and the things that you're looking for?
Well, thanks. I think obviously the single biggest thing that we've seen is that if you can't skate in this game, you can't play anymore. It's as simple as that. When I first started into this, remember, I would go back to the Broad Street Bullies, and that led to a whole series of the types of players that we would call, I can't think of any other word for them, but goons at some point. The day of those guys in this league are gone. I mean, there's still a lot of physicality to the game. In fact, probably more hits going on in the game now than there was when I was, the original researcher there at Maple Leaf Gardens recording hits and games. There's much more of that going on now than most people would realize. But there's really no room in the sport anymore. There's very little room in the sport anymore for guys that can't skate, handle the puck, those types of things. We just don't have that, two guys lining up beside each other and getting ready to go. And so I think that's probably And the fact that, how much emphasis is being put on the fitness level of the players compared to what it was originally, and in their conditioning and their, the amount of information that's available to players now to succeed is tremendous compared to what it was when I first went to New York as an assistant coach. I remember Mark Pavlich, who just recently passed. We were having our first training camp, the very first training camp when we got to New York, and we were going to start with a 3.5-mile run. That this was going to give us an indication of the fitness level of our players that come in. And we were all standing there. I think there would be about 60, 65 players at the time. And we were waiting and waiting. It was supposed to be a 9:00 start. And Mark Pavlich showed up right at 9:00 on the bell. And everybody said, "Don't worry about it. Pav will get here." And right, sure enough, at 9:00, he pulls up in his old beat up Jeep, gets out, and he's got a flannel shirt on, a pair of gym shorts, and they look like, very essential tennis shoes sort of thing. And we started our 3.5-mile run, and he was in by 30 seconds to a minute before anybody else even came. And it taught me that, let's not underestimate what players can do by their appearance, and it was a life lesson in terms of the amount of work that Pav put into his game versus guys that don't put that kind of work in, and he obviously did.
Oh, that's great, Jack. We're going to have to wrap up because we're done with time, but really want to thank you and Brian for this. I'm sure lots of us would love to have you guys maybe do an extended talk and hear some more of your old stories. There's some good questions in the Q&A that we just weren't able to get to. So thank you again.
Thank you. If you want to just pass those questions along, if I could, I'll send out an email to them, or if they want to do that, and I'll give them some kind of answer to them if it's possible.
Yeah, that's great. Shirley, are you introducing our next speaker, or am I?